2. Twin beggars saved the life of a fainting millionaire. What they ask for in exchange. In exchange for this will make you cry. Subscribe to the channel. Leave your like and a comment to support my work so that I can bring more and more beautiful stories like this. The rain poured mercilessly over Milwaukee's darkened streets as Michael Thompson stumbled out of his office building, his vision blurring. His expensive Italian suit, usually immaculate, was disheveled, his tie loose around his neck. The quarterly reports he'd been obsessing over for the past 18 hours had finally taken their toll, but he refused to acknowledge the warning signs his body had been sending for weeks. The streetlights swayed and multiplied before his eyes as he tried to make his way to his car. His breath came in short gasps, his chest tightening with each step. The rain soaked through his clothes, but he barely noticed, focused only on putting one foot in front of the other. "Just need to get home," he muttered, fumbling with his car keys. They slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering onto the wet pavement. As he bent to retrieve them, the world tilted violently, his knees buckled, and the cold, hard ground rushed up to meet him. In the shadows of a nearby alley, two small figures huddled together under a makeshift shelter of cardboard and plastic. Ava nudged her sister Lily, pointing at the fallen man. "Look," she whispered, her young face etched with concern. At 13, the twins had learned to be wary of adults, especially well-dressed ones who usually shooed them away from storefronts and restaurant entrances. "We should just stay here," Lily warned, always the more cautious of the two. "He's probably drunk." She pulled their thin blanket tighter around her shoulders, trying to shield herself from the bitter wind that cut through their worn clothes. But Ava was already standing, her eyes fixed on the motionless figure. "He's not moving, Lily. What if he's really sick?" Without waiting for an answer, she darted out into the rain. Lily hesitated for a moment before following her sister, knowing she couldn't let her face whatever this was alone. The girls approached cautiously, their feet silent on the wet pavement. Up close, they could see that the man's face was pale, almost gray, and his breathing was shallow and irregular. Ava pressed two fingers against his neck, the way she'd learned from watching medical shows through store windows. "His pulse is really fast," she reported, her voice trembling. "We need to get help." Lily glanced around the empty street, her heart racing. "The community clinic is just 2 blocks away. Maybe Dr. Sarah is still there." She knew the kind doctor sometimes worked late, treating those who couldn't afford regular medical care. Together, they managed to get Michael into a semi-sitting position. He was heavy, and their small frames struggled under his weight, but determination drove them forward. Step by painful step, they half-carried, half-dragged him through the rain-slicked streets. The clinic's lights were still on, a beacon of hope in the stormy night. "Akudua." Sarah was just preparing to leave when she heard the frantic knocking. Opening the door, she found 2 drenched girls supporting an unconscious man in an expensive suit. "Please," Ava gasped, her arms shaking from exertion. "He needs help." He collapsed on the street. Dr. Sarah quickly assessed the situation, her professional instincts taking over. "Bring him in," she instructed, already clearing a path to the examination room. As they laid Michael on the examination table, his eyelids fluttered, and he mumbled something incoherent. The doctor's initial examination confirmed what exhaustion and stress had wrought on his body. "Severe exhaustion, dehydration, and dangerously high blood pressure," she muttered, hooking up an IV. "He's lucky you found him when you did." While Dr. Sarah worked, the twins huddled in the corner of the room, leaving small puddles of water on the linoleum floor. They watched intently as she administered medications and monitored his vital signs, Ava especially fascinated by every medical detail. "You girls should go home," Dr. Sarah said gently, turning to them after stabilizing her patient. "It's late, and your parents must be worried." The sisters exchanged a quick glance, but said nothing. Dr. Sarah noticed their silence, the way they clutched each other's hands, and their worn, mismatched clothes. Her heart sank as she realized these were likely the homeless children she'd heard about from other clinic visitors. As the storm raged outside, Michael Thompson lay unconscious, unaware that his life had just been saved by two young girls who had every reason to ignore his plight. His expensive watch ticked away the seconds on his wrist, marking time as the carefully constructed walls of his isolated existence began to crumble. Michael's eyes opened slowly, his vision gradually focusing on an unfamiliar water-stained ceiling. The harsh fluorescent lights made him wince, and the antiseptic smell filled his nostrils. This wasn't his penthouse apartment or any hospital he would normally frequent. Confusion and panic began to rise in his chest as he tried to piece together how he had ended up here. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," a woman's voice said. He turned his head to see a doctor in worn scrubs approaching his bedside. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen. You gave us quite a scare last night." Michael tried to sit up but immediately regretted it as dizziness overwhelmed him. "Where am I? How did I get here?" His throat felt dry, his voice raspy. "You're at the River West Community Clinic," Dr. Sarah explained, checking his vitals. "Two young girls brought you in last night after you collapsed on Madison Street. Your blood pressure was dangerously high and you were severely dehydrated. When was the last time you properly rested, Mr. Thompson?" He ignored her question, his mind racing. "Girls? What girls?" The last thing he remembered was leaving his office, the quarterly report still swimming before his eyes. Movement in the corner caught his attention. Two small figures emerged from the shadows, thin, dirty, wearing clothes that had seen better days. They couldn't have been more than 13 years old. One girl stepped forward slightly, her chin raised with a quiet determination that seemed beyond her years. "I'm Ava," she said, "and this is my sister Lily." The other girl hung back, partially hidden behind her sister, watching him with wary eyes. Michael stared at them, his business-trained mind automatically cataloging details. Their clothes were mismatched and worn but clean where possible. Their faces were thin, but showed intelligence and resilience. These weren't the type of children he usually encountered in his carefully curated world of boardrooms and charity galas. "They stayed here all night," Dr. Sarah added, her voice carrying a hint of something, admiration, concern, that Michael couldn't quite identify. "Refused to leave until they knew you were stable." The information didn't compute in Michael's mind. Street children, he was sure that's what they were, had saved him. The same type of people he usually instructed his security team to keep away from his buildings. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Your wallet and phone are there on the table," Ava said, as if reading his thoughts. "We didn't touch them. We just couldn't leave you there in the rain." Michael reached for his wallet with slightly shaky hands, confirming its contents were indeed intact. Over $40,000 in cash, multiple credit cards, all untouched. These girls could have easily taken everything and left him there, but they hadn't. "Why?" The question escaped his lips before he could stop it. Lily, who had been silent until now, spoke so softly he had to strain to hear her. "Because it was the right thing to do." Her words, simple and direct, hit him with unexpected force. Dr. Sarah continued her examination, her movements efficient but gentle. "Mr. Thompson, your body is showing signs of extreme stress and exhaustion. Your blood pressure is still higher than I'd like, and your blood work indicates you haven't been eating properly. This collapse wasn't random. It was your body forcing you to stop." But Michael was barely listening. His eyes were fixed on the twins, particularly on Lily, who had pulled out a worn notebook and was sketching something with quick, sure strokes. Despite her shabby appearance, there was an undeniable grace in her movements. "How much do I owe you?" he asked Dr. Sarah, reaching for his wallet again. "And of course, I'd like to reward these girls for their help." Money. It was his default solution to everything. "We don't want your money," Ava said firmly, surprising him again. "But there is something you could do." She glanced at her sister, who nodded slightly. "What is it?" Michael asked, curiosity getting the better of him. "Build a shelter," Ava said, her voice growing stronger. A real one, for kids like us who don't have anywhere else to go. No one should have to sleep in alleys or under bridges. Michael felt his chest tighten, but this time it wasn't from physical distress. The girl's request was so unexpected, so far from the typical greed he encountered in his daily life, that it left him momentarily speechless. A shelter? He repeated, his businessman's mind automatically calculating costs, logistics, zoning laws. Yes, Lily spoke up again, turning her notebook around. On the page was a rough but surprisingly detailed sketch of a building, complete with dormitories, a kitchen, and what appeared to be classroom spaces. A place where kids can be safe, where they can learn and grow. Like this. Michael studied the drawing, noting the careful attention to detail. Windows placed to maximize natural light, communal spaces designed to foster interaction, even a small garden area. This wasn't just a child's fantasy, there was real thought behind it. Do you know who I am? He asked suddenly, wondering if this was some elaborate setup. You're Michael Thompson, Ava answered. We saw your picture in the newspaper someone threw away. You build things, big buildings and shopping centers, so you could build this too if you wanted to. The simple logic of her statement struck him. Yes, he built things, massive commercial complexes that generated millions in profit. But he had never built anything like this, anything that served no purpose except to help others. Dr. Sarah, who had been quietly observing this exchange, finally spoke up. Mr. Thompson, you're stable now, but I strongly advise you to take some time off work. Your body needs rest, and your current lifestyle is unsustainable. Michael barely heard her. His mind was already racing, but not with thoughts of quarterly reports or board meetings. Something about these girls, about their selfless actions and unexpected request, had cracked open a door he'd kept firmly shut for years. I'll need to make some calls, he said finally, reaching for his phone. And I'll need more details about what exactly you envision for this shelter. The hope that bloomed on Ava's face was almost painful to witness. But it was Lily's reaction that truly caught him off guard. A small, knowing smile that seemed to suggest she had seen something in him that he hadn't yet recognized in himself. As he began to dial his assistant's number, Michael felt a strange sensation in his chest. It wasn't the tight, constricting feeling of stress he'd grown so accustomed to. Instead, it felt almost like possibility. The following days brought a whirlwind of activity that left Michael feeling increasingly unsettled. His initial impulse to help the twins had seemed simple enough. Write a check, hire some contractors, and let his PR team handle the rest. But as he delved deeper into their lives, he found himself confronting uncomfortable truths that shattered his carefully maintained worldview. His assistant, Jennifer, had compiled a detailed background report on the girls. "Sir," she said, placing a manila folder on his desk with obvious hesitation, "you might want to read this privately." Michael waited until she left before opening the folder. The documents inside made his blood run cold. Emma Martinez, the twins' mother, had worked as a quality control supervisor at Safeguard Manufacturing, one of his subsidiary companies. She had filed multiple reports about substandard safety protocols and questionable labor practices, reports that had been systematically buried by middle management. 2 years ago, after being dismissed for insubordination, Emma had struggled to find work, blacklisted by her former supervisors. The mounting bills and stress had taken their toll, and she had died of a heart attack, leaving her daughters with no family and nowhere to go. Michael's hands trembled as he read the final memo in the file, dated just days before Emma's termination. Employee continues to raise unnecessary concerns about safety protocols. Recommend immediate termination to prevent disruption of established procedures. The words blurred before his eyes. He had never met Emma Martinez, had never even heard her name until now, but her death and her daughter's subsequent homelessness could be traced directly back to decisions made in his company's name. "Sir?" Jennifer's voice came through the intercom. The board members are assembled for the emergency meeting you called. Michael gathered his thoughts and straightened his tie, preparing to face the stern faces of his company's directors. He knew what was coming. He'd sat through enough of these meetings to predict every argument they would make. The boardroom was silent as he presented his plan for the shelter. He had barely finished speaking when Harrison Wells, the eldest board member, cleared his throat disapprovingly. "Let me get this straight," Harrison said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You want to divert company resources to build a homeless shelter because 2 street urchins helped you during a medical episode. Have you lost your mind?" "This isn't just about the shelter," Michael responded, struggling to maintain his composure. "It's about corporate responsibility, about making amends for past mistakes." "Mistakes?" Victoria Chen, another board member, raised an eyebrow. "What mistakes exactly are you referring to?" Michael hesitated. Exposing the Safeguard manufacturing incident would open a Pandora's box of legal issues and potentially damage the company's stock price. But looking at the smug faces around the table, he felt something snap inside him. "Emma Martinez," he said quietly, watching their reactions. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "She worked at Safeguard. She tried to warn us about safety violations, and we destroyed her life for it. Her daughters, the girls who saved my life, have been living on the streets because of decisions made in this very room." The silence that followed was deafening. Harrison was the first to recover. "That's ancient history, Michael, and frankly, not relevant to this discussion. The board has a responsibility to our shareholders. The board has a responsibility to do what's right," Michael interrupted, his voice sharp. "I'm not asking for permission. I'm informing you that this is happening. I'll fund it personally if I have to." Meanwhile, across town at the community clinic, Ava and Lily were helping Dr. Sarah organize medical supplies. The doctor had been letting them sleep in a back room since the night they brought in Michael, unable to bear the thought of them returning to the streets. "Do you really think he'll do it?" Lily asked softly, carefully arranging bandages in a supply cabinet. "Build the shelter, I mean." Ava paused in her work, considering. "He seemed different when he left, like something changed in him." "People like him don't change," an older homeless man commented from his seat in the waiting room. "They make promises, but they never follow through." Dr. Sarah watched the exchange with concern. She had seen the twins' hope growing over the past few days, and she worried about what would happen if Michael Thompson didn't come through. These girls had already experienced too much disappointment in their young lives. But that evening, as the clinic was closing, a sleek black car pulled up outside. Michael stepped out, looking exhausted but determined. He was carrying a large roll of blueprints under his arm. "Is it okay if we talk?" he asked the twins, who were helping Dr. Sarah close up for the night. "I want to show you something." They gathered around a small table in the clinic's break room. Michael unrolled the blueprints, revealing detailed plans for a multi-story building. "This is just a preliminary design," he explained, "but I wanted your input before we go any further." Lily's eyes widened as she studied the drawings. The building incorporated many elements from her sketch, but enhanced and made practical. There were dormitory-style rooms, educational spaces, a medical clinic, and even an art studio. "The board of directors isn't happy about this project," Michael admitted, watching their faces carefully. "They think it's a waste of resources. But sometimes doing the right thing means standing up to people who only care about profits." Ava looked up at him sharply. "Why are you really doing this? Is it just because you feel guilty?" The question caught Michael off guard. He had been asking himself the same thing ever since he read Emma Martinez's file. Was this just about alleviating his guilt, or was there something more? Before he could answer, Lily spoke up. "Mom always said that true change comes from the heart, not from guilt." She pulled out her sketchbook and showed him a drawing she had made, a portrait of their mother, smiling and full of life. She believed in helping others, even when it cost her everything. Michael felt his throat tighten as he looked at the drawing. Emma Martinez's eyes seemed to look right through him, challenging him to be better than the system that had failed her. "Your mother was a brave woman," he said finally. "She tried to make my company better, and we punished her for it. I can't undo that wrong, but I can try to honor her memory by helping others." The admission hung in the air between them. Dr. Sarah, who had been quietly observing, noticed tears in Ava's eyes. The girl quickly wiped them away, trying to maintain her tough exterior. "When do we start?" Ava asked, her voice slightly hoarse. "Tomorrow," Michael replied firmly. "I've already contacted architects and contractors, but I want you both involved in every step. This needs to be more than just a building. It needs to be a home." As they discussed details late into the evening, none of them noticed the figure watching through the clinic's window. A man in an expensive suit, taking photos with his phone. Harrison Wells smiled grimly as he sent the images to his colleagues. If Michael Thompson wanted a war with the board, he was going to get one. Back inside, Michael felt a strange sense of peace despite knowing the challenges ahead. For the first time in years, he was doing something that mattered, something that couldn't be measured in profit margins or stock prices. Lily had resumed sketching, her pencil moving quickly across the paper. When she finished, she showed Michael her latest drawing, a simple image of three figures holding hands in front of a building that looked like hope made real. The next few weeks brought both progress and mounting challenges. Michael threw himself into the shelter project with the same intensity he usually reserved for corporate acquisitions. But this time, the drive came from somewhere deeper than mere ambition. Every morning, he would stop by the clinic to pick up Ava and Lily, bringing them to the construction site where the shelter was beginning to take shape. Today, however, was different. Michael sat in his office staring at the morning paper with a mix of anger and disbelief. The headline screamed, "Thompson Industries CEO's mental health questioned after erratic behavior." The article, clearly fed by inside sources, painted him as a man having a breakdown, using company resources for questionable personal projects while allegedly neglecting his corporate responsibilities. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. Major shareholders were demanding explanations, partners were expressing concerns, and his PR team was in crisis mode. But what truly worried him was the subtle threat woven through the article. Vague mentions of past corporate incidents being investigated, a clear reference to Emma Martinez's case. Jennifer entered his office without knocking, her face pale. "Sir, the board has called an emergency meeting for this afternoon. They're invoking Article 7 of the company bylaws." Michael's stomach dropped. Article 7 allowed the board to temporarily suspend a CEO's authority if they could prove he was acting against the company's interests. He had helped write those bylaws himself, never imagining they would be used against him. "Also," Jennifer added hesitantly, "Child Protective Services called. Someone filed a report about 2 underage girls being involved in a construction project." Before Michael could respond, his private line rang, the one only a handful of people had access to. It was Dr. Sarah, her voice tight with concern. "Michael, you need to get to the clinic right now. Something's happened." He found the clinic in chaos. A team of CPS workers was attempting to interview Ava and Lily, while Dr. Sarah argued heatedly with a woman in a business suit. The twins were huddled together in a corner, Lily clutching her sketchbook like a shield, while Ava stood slightly in front of her sister, her jaw set in defiance. "Mr. Thompson," the woman in the suit turned to him as he entered. "I'm Margaret Walsh from Child Protective Services. We're responding to concerns about 2 minors being exposed to potentially dangerous situations." "This is ridiculous," Dr. Sarah interjected. "These girls are safer now than they've been in years. Michael has been helping them by putting them on an active construction site," Margaret countered. "We have photos, Dr. Chen, and there are other concerns about Mr. Thompson's relationship with these minors." Michael felt his world tilting. He had been so focused on building the shelter, on making things right, that he hadn't considered how his actions might be misconstrued. The board was clearly behind this, using the system against him just as they had against Emma. "You can't take them," he said, his voice hoarse. "They need to be here. They're part of this project." "That's not your decision to make, Mr. Thompson," Margaret replied firmly. "These girls need proper supervision and care in a licensed facility." "No," Ava's voice cut through the tension. "We're not going anywhere. You can't separate us." Her voice cracked on the last word, revealing the fear behind her brave facade. Lily had begun to sketch frantically, her pencil moving across the paper with almost desperate energy. When she held up the drawing, Michael's heart nearly stopped. It showed their mother, Emma, standing protectively over her daughters. The resemblance was striking. The same determined set of the jaw that Ava had inherited, the same gentle eyes that Lily possessed. Dr. Sarah moved closer to the girls, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. "I've been monitoring their health and well-being. They're not in any danger here. In fact, they're thriving for the first time since their mother died," Margaret finished. "Yes, we know about that situation, which raises even more questions about Mr. Thompson's sudden interest in their welfare." The accusation hung in the air like poison. Michael struggled to maintain his composure, knowing that any display of anger would only make things worse. But before he could respond, his phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. "Board meeting in 30 minutes. They have the votes to suspend you." He was being attacked on all fronts, and for the first time in his life, Michael Thompson, the man who always had a strategy, always knew his next move, felt completely lost. The empire he had built, the power he had wielded so confidently, meant nothing in the face of this crisis. "Please," Lily's soft voice cut through his panic. She held out another drawing, this one showing the shelter, half-built but already beautiful, with people working together to complete it. "This isn't just about us anymore. It's about all the other kids who need help." Her words struck him like a physical blow. She was right. This had grown beyond just helping two girls. The shelter represented something larger, a chance to change the way his company, his city, dealt with its most vulnerable members. Taking a deep breath, Michael pulled out his phone and made a call he'd been avoiding for weeks. "Richard, it's Michael Thompson. Yes, I know it's been a while. I need your help. It's time to tell the whole story about Emma Martinez, about Safeguard, about everything." Richard Chen was the city's most respected investigative journalist, known for his uncompromising integrity. He was also Dr. Sarah's brother, though few people knew about that connection. As he explained the situation to Richard, Michael watched Margaret Walsh studying the twins' interactions with Dr. Sarah and the clinic staff. Her professional mask had softened slightly as she observed the genuine bonds that had formed in this unlikely community. "Mr. Thompson," she said finally, "I'm willing to pause our investigation for 48 hours. Show me your plans for the shelter. Prove that these girls are part of something constructive rather than being exploited." It wasn't much, but it was a start. Michael looked at his watch. 20 minutes until the board meeting that could end his career. But looking at Ava and Lily, seeing their mother's strength reflected in their faces, he knew he couldn't back down now. "Dr. Sarah," he said quietly, "can you stay with the girls? There's something I need to do." Ava grabbed his hand as he turned to leave. "Don't let them stop you," she said fiercely. "Mom never gave up and neither should you." Michael squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her determination. As he walked out of the clinic, he could feel the weight of Emma Martinez's legacy on his shoulders. He had failed her once before. He wouldn't fail her daughters. In his car, he reviewed the documents he'd been gathering, evidence of systemic problems at Safeguard, proof that Emma's warnings had been justified, records of similar incidents that had been covered up. The board thought they could intimidate him with threats of exposure. They didn't realize he was ready to expose everything, no matter the cost to himself or the company. His phone buzzed again, Jennifer, warning him that Harrison Wells had arrived early for the board meeting, looking triumphant. Michael allowed himself a small smile. Harrison and the others had no idea what was coming. Sometimes doing the right thing meant burning everything down and starting over. As he pulled into the company parking garage, Michael caught sight of his reflection in the rear-view mirror. The face looking back at him was different from the one that had collapsed in the rain weeks ago. Older in some ways, but also more alive. For the first time in years, he knew exactly who he was and what he was fighting for. The Thompson Industries boardroom had never felt more hostile. Michael stood at the head of the table, facing the people who had been his allies and confidants for years. Now they looked at him like he was a stranger, or worse, an enemy to be eliminated. Harrison Wells sat directly opposite him, a slight smirk playing on his lips. The other board members were arranged like courtiers around their king, waiting to witness an execution. The afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany table. "Before we begin," Michael said, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "I'd like to introduce someone." He opened the boardroom door and Richard Chen walked in, digital recorder in hand. The journalist's presence sent an immediate ripple of unease through the room. "This is a closed meeting," Harrison protested, half rising from his chair. "He has no right to be here." "Actually, he does," Michael replied, laying a thick folder on the table. "As a major shareholder in Thompson Industries, Mr. Chen has every right to observe this proceeding. In fact, I've invited several other shareholders to join us virtually." He gestured to the large screen on the wall, where numerous faces were appearing in a grid pattern. Harrison's smirk vanished. This wasn't going according to his script. "The purpose of this meeting is to address concerns about Mr. Thompson's recent behavior and its impact on company interests," he began, trying to regain control. "We have evidence." "Evidence?" Michael interrupted. "Let's talk about evidence, Harrison." He opened the folder and began distributing documents to everyone present. These are internal memos from Safeguard Manufacturing dating back 5 years. They detail systematic violations of safety protocols, wage theft, and deliberate suppression of worker complaints. The board members began reviewing the documents, their faces growing pale. Michael continued, his voice gaining strength. "Emma Martinez wasn't the only employee who tried to warn us. She was just the most persistent, and we destroyed her for it. We made her unemployable, pushed her into poverty, and ultimately contributed to her death." "Ancient history," Harrison scoffed, but his voice lacked conviction. "And irrelevant to your current erratic behavior." "Is it?" Michael pressed a button, and new documents appeared on everyone's screens. "These are from last month. The same practices continue at Safeguard, the same cover-ups, the same retribution against whistleblowers. Nothing has changed, except now we have proof." One of the virtual attendees, a major pension fund manager, spoke up. "Mr. Thompson, are you saying the board knowingly allowed these practices to continue?" "Not just allowed, encouraged them. It was more profitable to silence complaints than to fix the problems." Michael turned to Harrison. "Isn't that right? That's what you told Emma's supervisor right before he fired her." Harrison's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "You're twisting things. We operate within the law." "Barely," Richard Chen interjected, making notes on his pad. "And often not even that. I've been investigating Safeguard for months. Emma Martinez's case was just the tip of the iceberg." Meanwhile, across town at the clinic, Ava and Lily sat with Dr. Sarah, watching the construction site through the window. Workers continued to move about, but there was an air of uncertainty. Everyone knew that the project's fate hung in the balance. "What if they stop it?" Lily asked softly, adding details to a new drawing, this one showing the shelter completed, filled with children finding hope and safety within its walls. "They won't," Ava replied with fierce conviction. "Michael won't let them." Dr. Sarah wasn't so sure. She'd seen how the system could crush even the strongest intentions, but before she could respond, Margaret Walsh returned from her inspection of the construction site. "I have to admit," the CPS worker said, reviewing her notes, "the plans are impressive. The attention to safety and child welfare concerns is extensive. And the educational programs you're developing—" She paused, looking at the twins. "You helped design these?" Lily nodded, showing Margaret her sketchbook. The CPS worker spent several minutes examining the drawings, her expression softening further. "These aren't just buildings," she said finally. "These are solutions, real, practical solutions to problems we've been struggling with for years." Back in the boardroom, the situation had devolved into chaos. Several board members were arguing heatedly about legal exposure, while others were frantically texting their lawyers. Harrison Wells sat in stony silence, his earlier confidence shattered. "Here's what's going to happen," Michael announced, his voice cutting through the noise. "First, Safeguard will be completely overhauled. Every safety violation will be addressed, every worker complaint investigated. Second, we're establishing a corporate responsibility division with real power to enforce ethical practices across all our subsidiaries." "You'll destroy shareholder value," Harrison protested weakly. "Will I?" Michael projected new figures onto the screen. "These are studies showing how companies with strong ethical practices consistently outperform their peers over the long term. We're not just doing the right thing, we're securing our future." He turned to the virtual attendees. "I'm asking for your support to clean house. Some board members will need to resign. Others will face legal consequences for their actions. But from this day forward, Thompson Industries will be part of the solution, not part of the problem." The voting began. One by one, shareholders registered their decisions. Michael held his breath, watching the numbers fluctuate. Finally, Jennifer entered with the final tally. The result was clear. Michael would remain CEO with a mandate to reform the company. Harrison Wells and his closest allies were out, pending investigations into their roles in the Safeguard scandal. As the board meeting concluded, Richard Chen approached Michael. "Hell of a story," the journalist said. "Mind if I interview those girls? Their perspective would add something powerful." "Ask them," Michael replied. "They're not props in our story. They're the reason for it." His phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Sarah. "Margaret approved emergency temporary guardianship for the girls to stay at the clinic while the shelter is completed. She said she's never seen a more appropriate support system." Relief flooded through him, but he knew this was just the beginning. The real work, rebuilding his company, completing the shelter, making things right, was still ahead. When he arrived at the clinic that evening, he found Ava helping Dr. Sarah organize medical supplies while Lily worked on a new drawing. The scene struck him with its simple rightness. These people had become more than just a cause to champion. They had become his family. Lily looked up as he entered, studying his face. "You won?" she asked, though it wasn't really a question. "We won," he corrected her. "All of us. Together." Ava abandoned her task and ran to hug him, something she'd never done before. After a moment's hesitation, Lily joined them. Dr. Sarah watched with tears in her eyes, remembering another woman who had fought for what was right, no matter the cost. As the sun set over Milwaukee, casting long shadows through the clinic windows, Michael held these two brave girls and made a silent promise, not just to them, but to their mother, to every Emma Martinez who had ever stood up against injustice only to be struck down. This was more than redemption. It was revolution, beginning with one shelter, one company, one city at a time. And it had all started because two young girls had chosen compassion over indifference on a rainy night that felt like a lifetime ago. 6 months had passed since the boardroom showdown, and Milwaukee was experiencing one of its warmest spring mornings in years. The sun painted the new building in soft golden light as Michael stood before it, taking in every detail. The Emma Martinez Youth Center rose 4 stories high, its modern design softened by careful landscaping and welcoming spaces. But it was more than just a building. It was a promise fulfilled. Inside, final preparations were underway for the grand opening. Ava darted from room to room, checking everything twice, her energy seemingly boundless. At 14 now, she had grown an inch taller and carried herself with newfound confidence. She'd been instrumental in developing the center's medical program, spending hours with healthcare professionals to ensure it would meet the needs of homeless youth. Lily, in contrast, sat quietly in the art studio she had helped design, putting the finishing touches on a mural that spanned an entire wall. The painting told a story, their story, through symbolic images that captured both the darkness of their past and the brightness of their future. At its center was a portrait of their mother, her eyes kind but determined, watching over everything. "It's perfect," Dr. Sarah said, entering the studio. She had accepted the position of medical director for the center, expanding her ability to help those in need. The clinic would remain open, but now it would have a partner facility specifically designed for young people in crisis. Michael watched Lily work, marveling at how far they had all come. The investigation into safeguards practices had led to major reforms across Thompson Industries. Harrison Wells and several other former board members were facing criminal charges, while the company had committed to new ethical standards that were already inspiring change in other corporations. "Mr. Thompson," Jennifer appeared at his side. "The press is starting to arrive, and the mayor is on her way." The opening ceremony would be covered by every major news outlet in the region. Richard Chen's expose had sparked a national conversation about corporate responsibility and youth homelessness. But more importantly, it had inspired action. Similar centers were already being planned in other cities, funded by business leaders who had been moved by what was happening in Milwaukee. "Is everything ready in the residence wing?" Michael asked, though he knew Ava would have checked it thoroughly. "Yes, sir. All 20 rooms are furnished and prepared. We already have 15 young people scheduled to move in next week, with support services in place." The residential program had been carefully designed to provide not just shelter, but a real path forward. Each resident would have access to education, healthcare, counseling, and job training. They would learn life skills while being surrounded by people who believed in their potential. Margaret Walsh arrived early, carrying a thick folder. She had become one of the center's strongest advocates, helping navigate the bureaucracy that might have otherwise delayed or derailed the project. "The final approvals came through this morning," she announced, handing Michael the documents. "The center is officially licensed as a youth residential facility and," she paused, smiling at the twins, "your fostering application has been approved." Ava froze in the middle of adjusting a display, while Lily's paintbrush clattered to the floor. They stared at Michael, who was trying to maintain his composure despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "Really?" Ava whispered. "You're really going to—" "If you want me to," Michael replied softly. "You'll have your own rooms at my house. But we can spend as much time here at the center as you want. Dr. Sarah has agreed to help with the transition." And he was cut off as both girls rushed to embrace him. In that moment, he wasn't Michael Thompson, CEO of a major corporation. He was simply a man who had learned to open his heart, thanks to two extraordinary young people who had saved him in more ways than one. The ceremony itself was a blur of speeches, ribbon cutting, and camera flashes. The mayor praised the initiative as a model for public-private partnership. Richard Chen spoke about the importance of journalism in exposing injustice and promoting change. Dr. Sarah described her vision for comprehensive youth healthcare. But the most powerful moment came when Ava and Lily stepped up to the podium together. The audience fell silent as Lily unveiled her final project, a portrait of all the people who had come together to make the center possible, from the construction workers to the medical staff to the social workers. At its heart were three figures, Michael and the twins, standing together as a family. "Our mum always told us that one person can change the world," Ava began, her voice clear and strong. "She tried to make things better, and even though she didn't live to see this day, her spirit is here in every brick, every room, every person who will find hope within these walls." Lily continued, her usual shyness forgotten in the importance of the moment. "This isn't just a building, it's a home for kids who need one, a safe place where dreams don't have to die." It's what happens when people choose to care, to look past appearances and see the real person underneath. In the audience, Doctor. Sarah wiped away tears, remembering the night two young girls had dragged an unconscious stranger into her clinic. Margaret Walsh nodded approval, her initial skepticism long since replaced by genuine admiration. Jennifer, standing at the back, smiled as she remembered how different her boss had been just 6 months ago. After the ceremony, as the crowd began to disperse, Michael found himself alone with the twins in the art studio. Lily's mural seemed to glow in the late afternoon light, their mother's painted eyes watching over them with pride. "I've been thinking," he said, sitting down between them, "about what happens next. The company is doing well. Better than ever, actually. The ethical reforms have attracted new investors and partners, but I'm going to step back from day-to-day operations." "What?" Ava looked concerned. "Why?" "Because there's more important work to be done. Other cities need centers like this. Other companies need to learn that doing good is good business, and..." He smiled at them both. "I have 2 daughters who are teaching me something new every day about what really matters in life." Lily reached for her sketchbook, a new one given to her by Michael to replace the worn-out one she'd carried for so long. She flipped it open to a fresh page and began to draw. Ava and Michael watched in comfortable silence as an image emerged, a road stretching toward the horizon, with 3 figures walking together, their shadows long but their steps sure. "Is that our future?" Ava asked her sister. Lily nodded, adding final touches to the sketch. "It's our journey. We don't know exactly where it leads, but we know we're on it together." Michael looked at the drawing, then at these remarkable young women who had changed his life so profoundly. He thought about Emma Martinez, whose courage had set all of this in motion. She would be proud of her daughters, not just for surviving, but for turning their pain into purpose, their challenges into change. The sun was setting over Milwaukee, painting the sky in brilliant colors. From the center's rooftop garden, they could see the city stretching out in all directions. Somewhere out there, other children were facing the same struggles Ava and Lily had endured. But now there was hope, a light in the darkness, a place where compassion and opportunity met. "Together," Michael agreed, putting an arm around each of them. "That's how we'll change the world. One day, one person, one act of kindness at a time." As they stood there, a family forged by fate and strengthened by love, the Emma Martinez Youth Center cast its welcoming light into the gathering dusk. Inside its walls, dreams would take root and grow. Lives would be transformed. And the legacy of a brave woman would live on through the countless young people who would find their way home. The journey that had begun on a rainy night with 2 acts of kindness, the twins helping a stranger, and a man learning to see past his own prejudices, had become something larger than any of them had imagined. It was proof that change was possible, that hearts could open, that love could triumph over indifference. And in the end, that was the greatest shelter of all.